Hi, good morning, everyone. As I said, my name is Kate Hudson. I'm the Deputy Vice President and Counsel for Government Relations and Public Policy at the Association of American Universities. My portfolio governs a pretty wide range of issues, but I advise and advocate on behalf of 69 U.S. and 2 Canadian top-level R1 research institutions. I am really honored to be moderator today, and I want to introduce you to our panelists and then set the stage for our discussion today. So to my right is Joe Allen, the Executive Director of the Bayh-Dole Coalition and a longtime advocate for innovation policy that strengthens research commercialization. To my left is Dennis Liotta, the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Chemistry at Emory University and one of the co-inventors of key HIV treatments, including Emtreva. Also to my left is Jennifer Luray, the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Public Engagement at Research America, where she leads efforts to strengthen the U.S. research ecosystem. And finally, John Stanford is the Executive Director of the Incubate Coalition, representing early-stage investors focused on life sciences innovation. Thanks for joining us today. I just want to set the stage before we get to our esteemed panelists and talk about the path from federally funded research to real-world treatments is not a straight line, and it is not automatic. The Bayh-Dole Act has been a catalyst, an absolute catalyst for American excellence, and since its passage has been the primary engine between America's innovation leadership. By allowing universities and research institutions to retain IP rights, it attracts private investment and ensures that the government-backed research is not left to gather dust. Joe will be sharing his insight into the history of Bayh-Dole in just a moment. Research is transformed into new therapies, diagnostics, and devices that improve patient health. However, the March-in debate is putting this innovative success at risk. Changing pressures and growing narratives that March-in rights need to be used to artificially suppress the cost and price to the economy of these innovative treatments coming out of Bayh-Dole Act-sponsored research. They not only are completely out of line with the bill's founders' intentions, but their enactment would have a devastating and lasting impact on our healthcare system. So with that, I'm going to get us started. So Joe, I'd like to turn to you for some opening remarks on the history of the Bayh-Dole Act.
Well, thank you very much. I actually wasn't born with white hair. So when I had brown hair, I was actually on the Senate Judiciary Committee for former Senator Birch Bayh from Indiana. And this is the 80th anniversary of really a seminal piece of recommendations that actually went to President Roosevelt. As we're winning World War II, the United States government had suddenly been funding research, which it really hadn't done before the war. And we built up the greatest research engine in the history of mankind, and that's not an exaggeration. So there was concern that after World War II, we might go back into the Depression, because that would have been going on for like 20 years before. So Roosevelt asked a man named Vannevar Bush, what should we do with all this R&D capability? And Vannevar Bush wrote a paper called Science, the Endless Frontier. And Bush said that it should be a purpose of the government now, not just to fund mission research for the Department of Defense and other agencies, but also to fund basic research. And that actually led to the National Science Foundation. So that was a huge breakthrough. But the other thing that happened, people didn't really think about this too much, was once you start funding research, inventions start coming out. And Vannevar Bush also was pretty astute in that. His recommendation was that if people make inventions with government funding, they should be able to manage it because they would know more about the inventions than anyone else. But unfortunately, we didn't listen to him. And so what happened was from 1945 until really 1980, when the government funded research, if an invention was made, it was taken away from the researcher to Washington and given away. And in 1945, that seemed like a nice thing to do. We had the Marshall Plan of economic help. And we had basically this was a technology help. The Germans and the Japanese particularly appreciated that because they were able to go through our basic research, find things that looked like it had some commercial application because we were not developing them. And so in the 1970s, when I was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, the world had changed. We were suddenly we actually lost steel, automotives, electronics. The Midwest, which had won World War II, is now the Rust Belt. And so my former boss, Senator Birch Bayh, And Robert Dole, who was a conservative Republican, started looking at that and said, we're funding billions of dollars of research, but nothing seems to be coming out the other end. And to the panel today, one of the things that was particularly acute was, to our shock, we found out not a single drug had been commercialized from all the billions of dollars going into NIH funding. And it wasn't because they're doing bad research. It was because there was no incentives and no ability for the private sector to turn these research ideas into new products. So the upshot was a thing called the Bayh-Dole Act. The other thing I'll add for any of you in Washington, we did this in an election year when Ronald Reagan was running against Jimmy Carter. My boss, Birch Bayh, was up for election. Senator Dole was leading the Republican charge. And even though they didn't agree on very much, they did agree to work together on this. And the Bayh-Dole Act passed with overwhelming support. And what it did was it actually decentralized management, as Vannevar Bush had recommended, to the universities, small companies, and federal laboratories making inventions. That led to the greatest renaissance in history, and it catapulted the United States back into the leadership across the board in innovation. But as Kate was saying, now people are starting to go back again to the same idea we had in 1945, that maybe if the government funds research, it shall be given away again. So, we learned that lesson once. It was very painful. I hate to have us relearn that, and we can talk a little bit more about it, but the bottom line is Bayh-Dole works. And if you don't believe me, ask the Chinese, because the Chinese have adopted Bayh-Dole, and their strategy now is not to just pass this in manufacturing, their also strategy is to pass this in basic research. So their universities are adopting Bayh-Dole. So if there's one thing we don't want to fiddle around with at this junction of our history, it's to undo what has been such an expensive lesson in the last 45 years and have to relearn the painful lessons that Vannevar Bush warned us against. So I'll stop with that. But again, I really appreciate what you're doing. But here's the bottom line. Do you want research papers or do you want cures? Now, under Bayh-Dole, you get both. You get research papers and cures. But if you destroy intellectual property rights, you're going to get research papers. So when you go to your doctor and you have a disease, they can say, geez, I had a great paper about that, Kate. I really wish I could help you. Maybe if you read this, it'll make you feel better. Or do you want to actually go there and say, we have a cutting-edge remedy now? And the final thing I'll say is, the United States leads the world in developing new pharmaceuticals and medicines, but we're the only country in the world where half of our new drugs come from small companies. So think about that for a second. So that is one of the things that makes us different. It's a hard thing to do. Most companies lose their money, but this is literally life and death.
I mentioned I'm a professor at Emory University, and I was involved in the first 12 years of my career there at Emory in basic research, and it was very satisfying. But I had friends and associates who were dying of HIV, and I didn't feel that pharma was doing enough. And we have to understand with pharma that at the time they saw a very tiny market, and people would take drugs like AZT for 6 months, a year, sometimes more, but they would pass, and the market remained static. And I'm not an economic genius, but I thought, what if we could find some drugs that kept people alive, and they'd have to take those drugs every day? That would tremendously expand the market and make a huge difference, a huge impact on the health of the public. So I got involved, and we were in the right place at the right time, I think, because we co-discovered the two very important drugs, emtricitabine and lamivudine, both of which are still first-line therapies. And one of the lessons that I learned immediately is, because of the length of time it takes to develop a drug, it could be as little as 5 or 6 years, as long as 13 to 15 years. There's huge costs associated with that. Who would put up $1 billion or more to develop a drug without a guarantee of exclusivity. And if I didn't do a good job in developing intellectual property that would provide that exclusivity, I might find a drug that was really fantastic, but no one would develop it because they couldn't, the economics just wouldn't make sense. So I learned intellectual property and also business development and regulatory affairs were all intertwined with the science, and you just couldn't do one without taking into account all the other pieces of the puzzle. And this creates a very interesting continuum. Back in the 80s and 90s, pharma switched from the fully integrated pharmaceutical company to a more development-oriented scheme. And this was great as far as academic researchers are concerned, because then we could be, if we do our jobs well, a potential pipeline for biotech, for pharma, and just this creates the process that allows the people who are taking the biggest risk to examine different technologies and see which ones they think could make a positive difference and could allow them to make enough profit so that they could continue to develop new life-saving drugs. So it's wonderful to be a part of it. I will also say academia, there's a special role for us. We, for example, our group at Emory started looking at single-stranded RNA viruses in 2014 because we knew that 70% of the viral disease burden worldwide came from those viruses. So we knew that there was a very high probability that the next pandemic would involve a single-stranded RNA virus. We didn't know which one it might be. There are hundreds of them. So we said, let's develop a broad-spectrum oral drug when that pandemic happens. Not if the pandemic happens, but when. And if you look at a history of pandemics over the last 100 years, you know that they're getting closer and closer, and the vast majority of them have involved single-stranded RNA viruses. That process, which started in 2014, led in 2023, 2022 through a partnership with Ridgeback Therapeutics and with Merck to molnupiravir, which received emergency use authorization. So we started working well before there was a pandemic, and this is where academia can play an important role that commercial sector organizations just can't. They're not going to spend a huge amount of time and effort on hypothetical markets. So again, there's an important continuum where I think we work together and bring this forward, but central to this all is having intellectual property protection, because that is one of the most important de-risking activities you can do. Thank you.
So Research America's mission is to support science discovery and innovation to achieve better health for all. And one of the ways we do this is to support the medical research ecosystem that exists in the US, which is unparalleled, as you've heard so far. It's unparalleled in part because of Bayh-Dole. Bayh-Dole is the structural girding that enables this ecosystem to function so well, the ecosystem of academics, of, first government, academia, industry, both small businesses and larger companies, and private research institutes, all playing interconnected roles. So the vision of the ecosystem is what is so unique in American medical innovation. But without Bayh-Dole, that ecosystem simply would not exist. So here's some stats. This is from a report that the Center for Strategic and International Studies put out in January of 23, that since 1980, American universities alone have generated over $1.3 trillion in economic growth, 4.2 million jobs, and 11,000 startups that can be directly attributed to the Bayh-Dole's enactment. By the way, this is also could stand as support for universities, which is important in today's climate as well, the economic role of universities. We know from our omnibus survey that we do every January that the American public strongly supports the role of federal funding for basic research. We ask this question every year, even if it brings no immediate benefits. Basic scientific research that advances the frontiers of knowledge is necessary and should be supported by the federal government. And we get an overwhelming positive response, regardless of somebody's political identity. I'd also like to say, and we can talk more about this, that Bayh-Dole, it's a very transparent process. Tech transfer is very transparent. And before this weekend when I was preparing, I thought, all right, let me see what one of our local universities is doing. So I went on the GW, the George Washington Tech Transfer site. I was able to pull up a list of innovations and technologies that are available for licensing. There's also information for researchers on how to prepare your portfolio for industry. So much information is out there, and that's true across the country. So this is not a behind-the-scenes process. It's a very open, very transparent process that has enabled U.S. medical innovation to just be unparalleled in the world.
I feel like we've gone in order of the continuum here. Representing life science venture capital, we come at the end of the tech transfer process, and it is our responsibility to source funds that are going to pay to see transformative basic research into something that a patient would actually take, and to state just how critical intellectual property protections are to the venture community. The organization I run, Incubate, which is 8 years old, was founded exclusively to try to help policymakers connect the dots between strong IP policy and the kind of outcomes we want in new company creation, value creation, and most importantly, helping the lives of patients. It dated back to a time when we had policymakers on the Hill openly saying that drugs are developed at the NIH, that large manufacturers are effectively marketers and distributors, and the taxpayer really should be seeing a return. And I remember getting a call from some VCs saying, well, wait a second, what about our $40 to $50 billion a year that we're putting into the system? And as I think about our failure rate, about 9 in 10 of our investments fail. It's a really low hurdle of success. They don't tell you this in middle school, that you can go into a business where you only got to get it right every once in a while. But sometimes when I'm sitting with policymakers, many of whom are advocating for the changes we're here to talk about, I say to them, what would you think about an 1,000% rate of return? And sure enough, many of them who support weakening IP would say, that's outrageous. It's exactly the kind of thing we have to stop by doing something like margin or other ways we're exploring to weaken the IP system. Well, if you do the math, and I used to be a high school math teacher, if 9 in 10 investments fail, that 10th investment of ours has to yield an 1,000% return just to break even. And if you look at your 401k or pension fund or retirement or your university's endowment, you probably don't want to see it breaking even over the course of your lifetime. And so for that reason, it is critically important that the few successes venture capitalists have, they have to be able to drive a big enough return to keep it attractive. And IP is the only thing, if you've ever walked through one of these biotechs, had the opportunity to go to a BioLabs or Lab Central, there's just not a lot there. IP is the only thing that we are investing in when we put in $50 million, $100 million, up to $1 billion. And so we get very concerned when people talk about threatening that asset, because that's simply what it is. By the time We want to take one of these companies to the incredible manufacturers that finish off the relay race of drug development. The only thing we have in our hand is a rock-solid confidence that this asset can be protected. And so it gives us great concern that anyone would seek to erode that. The history of how successful has been it was very clear with those numbers. But when we think about, when you get to fundamental principles, the question you're asking yourself in a world with less IP protection is, do you want centralized research picking winners and losers out of Washington? And will we get 50 of the same drug? What we have seen time again is the market forces and entrepreneurship is what doesn't just drive new drug innovation, but new modality innovation. You don't get mRNA, you don't get biologics if a centralized government is saying, let's just stay in the line of small molecules. And so the last 40 years, as much as it's a story of incredible innovation, it's an incredible story of risk-taking and one that can't happen without strong IP.
Thanks, everyone. I'd like to ask the panelists a few questions now, Jennifer, and maybe Dennis, the two of you could answer this. How do partnerships between biopharmaceutical companies and research institutions really accelerate the development of drugs and medical devices?
Well, I started talking about that in terms of the role of tech transfer offices, which are just critical. There's a wonderful association called Autumn that many of you may be familiar with, and if you go on their website, you can learn so much about the role of tech transfer. So that's really the key meeting point. You know, that's the place to go have a cup of coffee, right? With someone who knows about what are the innovations at the discovery level, not at the development level, at the discovery level that have occurred in this university, which may be ready for commercial licensing. So it's a matchmaking game. The other thing I wanted to say is that at each stage of drug development, the costs involved increase exponentially. So from roughly hundreds of thousands of dollars to basic research, to millions for preclinical testing, to hundreds of millions more for late-stage clinical trials. And the late-stage clinical trials are often where the manufacturers come in. And often they come in sooner, too, in terms of the preclinical testing. But I think that's really important to keep in mind, that the federal funding through NIH is really seed corn. That's how we talk about it, as the seed corn for the development of therapies that will help millions of Americans. It starts there, but it certainly doesn't end there.
So I'd like to answer this with a personal anecdote, which I think might be instructive. Back in 1998, emtricitabine was in the middle of clinical trials. And as a medicinal chemist, that meant my only role there was to be a voyeur. I could just sit on the sidelines and watch everything happen, but I wasn't doing anything. So my colleague Raymond Shanazi and I decided to start a new biotech company, which we called Pharmaset. And that was a contraction for pharmaceutical assets. And our idea was we were going to take all the pharmaceutical assets from our lab and put them in this company and then develop them all. Well, of course, all these pharmaceutical assets, the vast majority of them were not suitable for development. In fact, I don't remember how many we put in, but I have a high school math teacher sitting next to me, so I'll say if there were n in the mix initially, n-1 failed. Not too different from the numbers you're stating, but one area seemed promising, and that is the development of nucleoside analogs to treat hepatitis C. And so we did some work in the university, but then we passed the baton on to Pharmaset. And Pharmaset hired some great scientists and some great business development people and partnered with some good intellectual property attorneys. And they developed an oral agent, which in around 20 2011 or 2012 was just doing amazing things in hepatitis C. The standard of care at that point had been pegylated interferon and ribavirin. It was a regimen that took 30 to 50 weeks. You had flu-like symptoms the entire time. The cure rate was very low. This went to sofosbuvir, also known as Sovaldi, which now in a 12-week regimen as a monotherapy cured about 80% of the people with hepatitis C, and as other drugs came and they could develop combination therapies, those rates went up to the high 90s. So this was, we don't often have the luxury of using the C word, cure, to describe what we do, and this was really amazing. And the company was acquired by Gilead Sciences for $11.2 billion. And I used to say $11 billion, and then one of my colleagues reminded me that $0.2 billion is $200 million, and I shouldn't do the rounding off there. But so the money part is always fun to talk about, but the impact of this is tremendous. So much so that Gilead's sales now have gone significantly down because so many people have been cured. Isn't that a fantastic outcome, right? And it happened through a partnership between academia and a biotech company, and ultimately a large pharmaceutical company. This is just, I think, one really great example of what we should be doing going forward, because the risks are so high. We have to find a way of working together to mitigate those risks. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Dennis. Joe, I'll turn to you. Can you talk about how the Bayh-Dole Act safeguards these kinds of processes and what threats to this legislation could change the future of medical advancement in the United States?
Sure. This is actually the 45th anniversary of Bayh-Dole, which I was only 5 years old when I worked on it, which is amazing to be that much of a prodigy. But the incredible thing is Bayh-Dole works for a simple reason. One part is it was actually drafted by people who had hands-on experience in this process. It wasn't drafted by me, it wasn't drafted by Birch Bayh or Bob Dole. We had enough sense to actually talk to people that actually knew the system. It was drafted by a man named Norman Lacker, who was then the patent counsel at NIH, who saw in frustration how these potential cures were just going nowhere, and a guy named Howard Bremer. Jennifer mentioned Autumn. Howard Bremer was one of the people that started Autumn from the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. And Autumn had actually, Wisconsin actually had, they had made an invention with their own funds, and NIH said, if you don't give it to us, we're going to cut off any of your government funding. So again, of course, it went nowhere. So the purpose of Bayh-Dole is to give simple rules, and one thing that John said we ought to go back and think about. The real heroes of Bayh-Dole are not the universities, not the federal laboratories, they're entrepreneurs. Again, if you want to get rich quick, a 90% failure rate is probably not something you're going to get into. So this is a long haul, and so Bayh-Dole has some simple rules for universities. Make sure you're going to license small companies of preference. This is something that when globalization was in vogue here 10 years ago, we were looked down our nose for this. Bayh-Dole is one of the first statutes that emphasized making things in America. It also remember, universities had not really owned inventions before Bayh-Dole. So one of our concerns was we didn't want to have a dominant company go to a university, offer them a bunch of money to license an invention that make it sit on the shelf. Suppose it's going to obsolete some of your current products. So the purpose of March-in rights was to make sure that if a university licensed a company, the company was making a good faith effort to turn that into a product. And I'm not just saying this is a theory. I was a staffer who put the hearing together. I wrote the Senate Judiciary Committee report. I oversaw the law at the Commerce Department. That's how the law works. And for 20 years, no one questioned that. So 20 years after Bayh-Dole passed, some of the same people who wanted to give technologies away came up with a counter history of Bayh-Dole, where they said that the Purpose of margin rights allow the government to set prices on resulting products. And I had not worked for Birch Bayh for 20 years. I never called him Birch Bayh, I would call him Senator Bayh. I hadn't worked for him for 20 years, but I saw this in the Washington Post. So I got a hold of him and said, Senator, we've got to respond to that. So he got a hold of Senator Dole, who had also been at a law firm, and they wrote back and said, that's not the purpose of our law. So the reason Bayh-Dole works is, if you're going to get people to invest their money, knowing it may take them 2 decades, for immunotherapy, for mRNA, they took the university 10 years to find a licensee. The first licensee was a small company in both cases. Moderna, who licensed mRNA, made no money for 10 years. All right, so if you think somebody's getting rich quick, just imagine running a company with no income for 10 years. Biotechnology, it took them 20 years to come up with a product. And in Washington, people were afraid of biotechnology for killer tomatoes. So if you had not had a thing like, if that had been managed by the government, God knows where we'd be in biotechnology. So these are long-term things, but again, if you start messing with the rules and you start saying, okay, John, you did get that 10%, now we're going to change the rules. Because if someone in Washington doesn't like your price, we're going to take it away from you and let a copier make it. No one is crazy enough to put their own money into doing that. So the upshot's going to be, it's going to hurt the small companies, but what drove Bayh-Dole, as I said before, was the realization that the government is funding literally billions of dollars of cutting-edge research, and nothing's coming out. I'll just give you one quick story, which Birch Bayh never told me. When I was on his staff, his wife was dying of breast cancer when we were doing Bayh-Dole. And she was out at the National Institutes of Health getting some experimental therapies. And she knew it was too late for her. But she also realized that these things would never become available because they were not going to be commercialized. And she said, Birch, you've got to do something. Now, that's the kind of person he was, but that was the driver of Bayh-Dole because he knew firsthand that if you don't get these things out, other people like Marvella Bayh were going to be needlessly dying and suffering, and that benefits no one. So this is not a game. The Bayh-Dole system works, and if you start monkeying around with it, we're going to go right back to where we were before. We're going to have people dying because these things are going to lay on the shelf because people like John, and remember also, mRNA, immunotherapy, biotech, who started them? Small companies, not big companies, they got in later. And most of those small companies lost their money. But that's what makes America great. That's what makes us different than China. So if you mess around with Bayh-Dole, if you're going to mess around with the incentives, no one's going to fund the companies, John's company, because you can't, right now, it's going to take you 20 years and 90% failure rate. If it looks like if you do make the 10%, a copier can make it cheaper, they're going to take it away from you. If that worked, kids, Venezuela would be the most innovative country in the world.
John, I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sitting next to pretty accomplished people, I don't know how much I'll contribute here, but the one thing I know, if there's one thing to take away from the venture perspective, uncertainty is as bad policy. And I think that's critically important for people in Washington to remember, is we don't have to scrap Bayh-Dole for the damage to get done. We have to make enough uncertainty risk just make these investments too risky. And we're already talking about the riskiest sector in the US economy. So we're already right at sort of the knife's edge. For those of you who follow the small biotech universe, it hasn't been a great 5 years. Hasn't really been a great 10 years. We've had some really promising science not bear out. And then we've had some really promising science make transformative treatments. But the specter of Washington and the threats to IP, they don't have to be enacted or executive orders for them to start to take root in the idea of the limited partners, the pension funds, that this space is just too risky. And so I just want to stress that it's dangerous enough to even be having this discussion, that we have to sit around a table and say Bayh-Dole worked in the context of do we want it to continue, is exactly what people who are raising tech funds and AI funds want to hear, because that is money that will move out of the biotech sector and into another sector. So uncertainty is as bad policy, and that's what we're getting.
A handful, maybe a dozen march-in petitions have landed on the desk of the NIH director over the years, and they've been denied because NIH is charged with advancing science and technology, not determining the market position of a product. And, just if you just think about if NIH were turned into, sort of a CMS, it became part of its mission. I mean, it would rob us of so much valuable research and would be so antithetical, really, to the mission of NIH. So it's really also about understanding what the mission is of NIH, and that's really critical as well. They don't want that responsibility, nor do they have the skills to have that responsibility. I also want to just make a little commercial for NIH and the FDA right now, which are not being funded and supported in the way that they should, and that is also going to impact our biomedical research ecosystem. So I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Joe, to what extent can government overreach impede patient access to these life-saving medicines?
Well, I think we've sort of touched on that. Again, the main thrust of Bayh-Dole was to decentralize management out of Washington to the people like Emory University, where Venice was. Because back to what Vannevar Bush says, who manages early stage technologies better? Somebody in Washington or somebody who actually has hands-on experience? So that's the balance of Bayh-Dole. Now, there are some things where the government has a role. You need to make sure you report your inventions. You need to make sure you're trying to commercialize them. But other than that, government gets out of the way. But in Washington, people tend to think they're smarter than other people. And so you still have this tendency, not just with march-in rights, but also we have agencies, including NIH, DOE, National Science Foundation, which have decided they want to start telling universities how to license technologies. And the Bayh-Dole Coalition has objected to that. And one thing that I have to give President Trump credit for is he put out one of his executive orders asking for circumstances where agencies are violating the law. So we wrote back with 5. We said, here's 5 blatant violations of Bayh-Dole where agencies are trying to re-centralize technology management. And the danger to that is, first of all, the universities know much more about licensing than the government does. But now you're starting to put uncertainty back in the system. You're starting to delay the system. You're starting to make it so you can't really make deals because you have to keep going back and forth. And that's what kills Bayh-Dole. Bayh-Dole is antithetical to bureaucratic overreach. It takes a long time to do this already. And when you start having people second guessing that, or even worse, saying, okay, you played by the rules, you did everything you said, but now we're going to change the rules. Well, no one is going to go with that. So that's the real danger. As John said, we've had 45 years of experience. We've been doing this experiment for 45 years. We did the other experiment for 45 years. So we actually have objective data. If you take rights away, what happens? Well, nothing. If you give rights to the universities, what happens? Well, we're now the most innovative country in the world. So we can show the data, we can show the stories. But the other thing I'll say is, in Washington, you have to keep going back and re-educating people. Not that they're stupid. The one thing about Bayh-Dole didn't create any bureaucracy. There's nobody in Washington that's hyping Bayh-Dole. There's no agency bureaucracy, which is always, because Bayh-Dole basically is decentralized. It didn't create any bureaucracy, didn't incur any additional costs on the taxpayer. So it really doesn't have, people in Washington running around hyping Bayh-Dole all the time, which is one of the reasons we started the Bayh-Dole Coalition. We have to go back and explain to people this because they haven't heard the story before. And the other story is simple. The government's funding research, people are making money, that's unfair. We should make it more fair by letting more and more people use it for free. And that does resonate. I mean, drugs are expensive, healthcare is expensive, and so if you tell people they're being cheated and they've never heard the other side of the story, the other side is a much simpler story to tell than our side. It's wrong, but it's simple. And it does resonate. So we always have to be, as John said, it's a shame we're having to do the basics, but that's the way life is. So we just have to accept that and go out. And the final thing I'll say is, we have one big advantage. What we're saying is actually true. So we shouldn't shortchange that. We have stories, we have statistics. The other side has rhetoric. And the reason we've won, as Jennifer said, there have been marching petitions for 20 years. Everyone has been dismissed, even under the Biden administration. Why? Because we're able to show, first of all, the law doesn't work this way. And secondly, if it does, these drugs are not going to be commercialized at all. And we can prove that. And the other side was caught flat-footed because after their rhetoric, they have nothing else to stand on.
I'll just add that on a very practical level, even if you did march in, almost all drugs covered by Dole have multiple patents. So there's, there might be a government patent, but there are going to be many other patents that weren't issued by the government, that were issued by the private sector. So to your point, Joe, there's a misunderstanding of how Bayh-Dole works, but also a misunderstanding of how drugs, complicated medical products come to market.
So I remember hearing about Xandy more recently in the last couple of years. And I guess Joe, I wanted to respond to what you said. It is a very easy story to tell, to say government contributed to this research, it's an expensive drug, but I guess, why was this kind of pushed so hard? Was it just part of the whole narrative around direct negotiation and the need to control drug pricing? If what you're saying is really like it's dangerous for the United States and potentially dangerous for patient access and all of this, why were they pushing it so hard?
I had to smile. That is a great question. And I'll give you a candid answer. Xandy, they've filed a marching petition against Xandy at least 8 times, okay? Going back to the Obama administration, they filed it 4 times in the Obama administration. Xandy is a prostate cancer drug. It came out of funding from NIH and the Department of Defense. So let me back up a little bit. There were people that didn't like Bayh-Dole, that fought Bayh-Dole. One was Ralph Nader. You've heard of Ralph Nader?
Yeah.
Okay, Ralph Nader has Public Citizen, and he also has a thing called, and I don't even have any idea what this name means, but it is their name, Knowledge Ecology International. I didn't make it up, that's their name. These are people who are dedicated to destroying Bayh-Dole. They fought Bayh-Dole then, they're fighting Bayh-Dole now. They're the people who wrote the alternative history to Bayh-Dole, alleging you can do price control. Every Democratic and Republican administration which has had an Xandy marching petition has denied them. Obama denied them 4 times, but they just keep refiling. Why do they keep refiling on Xandy? Because, as Jennifer said, most drugs have multiple patents that can't be copied if you marched in. Xandy's the exception. So Xandy you actually could march in, but the strongest denial of a marching petition actually came out in the Biden administration. Now, it took them 1.5 years to do it. They were under tremendous pressure from Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, all the usual cast of characters to march in Xandy. And the Biden administration shot it down. But what they also did as a political sop was, on one hand, they said you can't march in Xandy. On the other hand, they put out a thing called the march-in guidelines, which are still pending, which also say that price could be a factor for marching in. So they denied it, but then they come up with a framework saying maybe you could do it. So the reason they're marching in on Xandy, or trying to, is, first of all, actually you could march in there. But the second thing is, I think it's a great fundraising tool for them, because they keep going back and say, boy, if you had Xandy in Bolivia, it'd be cheaper than it is here. Therefore, we should take it away and make it freely available. That's a whole nother different argument. But legally, again, Obama, Trump, Biden, what do they have in common? Not very much, but they've all said, no, you cannot march in on price control. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if they don't refile that again, because it's the kind of thing that I think it's a great fundraiser. It looks like the kind of thing you do. But these folks are 0 for 20 years on march-in petitions. So if you look at their success rate is 0% as opposed to... They would envy a 10% success rate. They're at 0%. And the reason is what they're saying is bogus. But again, Xandy is their one example where they actually could march in, but even the Biden administration, as much as they may have wanted to, couldn't pull the trigger because the law doesn't say that. And I'll just add one more thing. The Bayh-Dole Coalition has a thing called our digital library because, again, I wrote the Senate Judiciary Committee report. So I'm reading this treatise, which is actually quoting my report saying they could march in for price control. So what they did was they took one sentence I wrote about something, another sentence about a thing all together, and combined them together and to imply that we said they can do price control. So we put on our website, anybody can see it for free, the original documents, going back to 1945, Vannevar Bush, all the way forward. We even put their bogus history on our website, so you can actually see it, and we have Birch By's rebuttal to it. So I think one thing that's actually changed the debate is we can now say, don't take my word for it, read the original documents. It's crystal clear what the law says. We have every NIH petition on there. Don't take my word for it. Read what Biden's people said about extending. And I think that's also changed the debate because the other side, once you go past the rhetoric, there's nothing behind the screen.
Because I think you're touching on something that's actually larger and we're dealing with. There are some provisions in the IRA that are de facto end runs around IP. I mean, it all comes back to IP. And if you look at the price negotiation from our perspective, it's a price control. It's eroding the value of IP after X date, whether it's 9 years or 13 years. So effectively what the IRA did do, it all comes back to IP. They made that IP relatively useless in a post-negotiation standpoint. But I think when you ask, so your question of, well, why are people pushing this? I get a similar question on some other policies of, well, what's the reason here? And I think when we think of the patient community, I've started to really think we live in this world of haves and have-nots. If you have a treatment that's working, then the only thing left to discuss is, can we get that cheaper? And so you get all the energy for anyone who's got a drug out there just pushing to how can I get this? People have short memories. They don't want to hear about the 20-year drug development. They don't want to hear about $3 billion. They want to know, I know this drug works for me. I want it for free. I want it as low as possible. And so the haves are exerting through the KEIs of the world and others this downward pressure, which coincidentally leads to some logistical challenges around shortages and genericization that we've seen this problem. But you can at least grant the community that has this. You can see why they push for something. They're throwing everything at the wall to drive that price downwards. And you can understand that. What we don't talk about is the have-nots. The people, the rare disease patients who have no treatment. And if this debate is going to move forward, I'd like to see the debate end, but if it's going to move forward, I think it's time we have an honest conversation that those are two divergent patient populations. And the have-nots are desperate for the Bayh-Dole Acts of the world. They are desperate for money from early stage to keep pouring in, and they're desperate. It's great to see some manufacturers around the table. They're desperate for manufacturers to stay interested in their therapeutic area. And what the IRA has pulled back, and I think would be precedent setting if we went further down this IP road, is people will step away from patients who the science is there. We saw great trial data in generalized myasthenia gravis last week, and the company said, we've got great 3A data, but we got to walk away. The economics here make no sense. And so for the patient population that are the have-nots, I don't think we talk about them, and I think they're the real beneficiaries of things like the Bayh-Dole Act, and help explain why we see some very strange proposals these days.
If you see what they really, really want, it's really not price control. What they really, really want is they want the government developing drugs. You'll hear KEI talk about divergence between markets and R&D. They weren't happy when you got the mRNA vaccine for free. They weren't happy with that. They were mad that Moderna made money. Now, Moderna made no money at all for 10 years. If you look at Moderna's stock now, they had a big rise, Al, but then when the COVID thing went down, so Moderna's laying people off. But they were outraged that Moderna actually made money after 10 years, so They got the COVID vaccines for free. Did anybody pay for a COVID vaccine? I don't think so. They weren't happy with that. So again, what they were unhappy with was a private company commercialized this technology, made money, and the alternative is you would have a bureaucracy in Washington decide which diseases are we going to fund. Now, I'll tell you one thing, you can bet that mRNA is not going to get funded, immunotherapy is not going to get funded, biotech's not going to get funded, because conventional wisdom at the time was those are too dangerous. Conventional wisdom is always wrong in the long run. But that's what they were looking at. We're smarter than you, we're smarter than industry, we're going to have the bureaucracy sitting around here together with political people. You want to have political people deciding which drugs get developed? And that's what really bugs them. They really want to have that centralized control. And there's not a single drug that I know of that's ever been developed by a socialist country.
I want to raise some issues very much related to this that haven't been explicitly touched on. I think there's some implicit discussion. But if, for example, using Bayh-Dole as a tool for price control were allowed to go forward, what would this do to university research in general? So we have a lot of representatives from pharmaceutical companies here. You've already pointed out how high the risk is in developing a drug. Now, would you want to license a university technology if there was a chance that you went through the entire process, you made a very successful drug, and then all of a sudden, government said, you can't charge those prices. You can't try and recoup your investment that you made. You have to charge these much lower prices. It's not going to be a happy time for the pharmaceutical company that just invested $1 or $2 billion in the process. So they're going to be reluctant to touch university technologies because there's a risk that can occur post the successful approval of the drug to treat whatever disease state it is. And that is devastating. And that is going to then really put a damper on university research. One other point that may not be obvious, but I was the editor-in-chief of a journal called ACS Medicinal Chemistry Letters, and for 13 years. And we noticed over that time that the amount of contributions, early stage drug development, that were contributed by people, scientists from China, went up dramatically. And so they learned how to play the game of early stage development, discovery and early stage development. And if we do this, if we allow this Bayh-Dole pricing tool, what it wasn't intended to occur, then the American university system is going to be in decline, and China will eat our lunch. They haven't learned the full development process as well as we do. They're making tremendous progress. But if we suddenly say, put a damper on university research output, then they're going to take over. And I think that's pretty ironic in the current administration, who has such antipathy for China, that they would be actually giving them a giant gift.
Well, I was just going to add, because of the uncertainty and chaos in academic research right now, we know that the Chinese have come to the U.S. and are, looking for researchers to go to China, and Western Europe is doing the same. Now, there's a lot of international cooperation among scientists, and Chinese scientists who have come to the United States have contributed tremendously. But the notion that really brilliant, creative researchers would be leaving the U.S. because of the instability and uncertainty caused by current policies is really a tragedy, and something that we've really got to deal with. I just wanted to make one other comment, although I think we're at 10:15. Okay, I was just going to comment that there are market failures, right? There are conditions and diseases that the economics, it's hard to add up to something that is going to be profitable. So what do we do about that? And we have mechanisms for that. NIH has an intramural program, which is a fraction of what it funds, but it exists. We have foundations, we have BARDA. So we have mechanisms that do help to create markets that may not be there otherwise. That's also why NIH invested in vaccines for so long. It's very hard that's a tough market, right? So anyway, I wanted to make that point, that there are situations where diseases are going unmet, not because we may not have the scientific basis, but the economics are tough. And then, we have to find these creative ways of doing that, but marching is not what's going to get you there.